Okay, my name is Carlos Lopez Hernando, although usually I go by Carlos L Hernando, which is shorter. And I am a game designer and a writer. And I have my own company, Flying Beast Labs, which is a video game development studio. But I also do freelance work and I write articles, that kind of stuff. I'm based on the gaming experience and in the narrative experience. What I really like is telling stories and creating great experience. When I was little, I read a lot. It was weird. I think it was a relief for my parents because I was like a hyperactive active kid, always breaking things and stuff. But I also spent hours reading, and when I started playing video games, like it blew my mind. I I of course also watch movies and stuff, but reading and video games were the things that really got me hooked. And I even when I was a child, I realized that you can even tell stories talking to your friends, something that had happened, and there was like some kind of connection. Of course, I couldn't express that way when I was a child, but I found that there were something there. So I wrote some things, and I even start programming and how language works and bring people together, or even language can create conflict. I don't know. I was fascinated by that. It would be the Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. My my father really well. I suppose he realized how I was, so he lent me some books, and he gave me this. I don't know. I was probably 9 years old or 10 years old, and it's a complex game, but it's about a child and that is a genius. So as a kid, you can easily relate to it, but the thematic is really adult. So I have read it like I don't know 30 times, lots of times. It's like a little obsession, and you discover things all the time. And I think it's really good to learn also empathy because it's a book about a war in theory, but it's more about understanding the enemy. And even it's science fiction. You know, the war is against an alien race, so it's so different from human in the kind of society they have. Everything is different, and the child who is the genius who needs to lead the human to destroy them ends understanding them. So I think it's a really good book. Words are free. You know, it's in your mind. If you can imagine, you can write it. But everything that you put on paper, if it has to be on a screen, it also applies to cinema because if you say there is a dragon, you need a guy to make the concept of the dragon. You need a guy to model the dragon, animate the dragon, program the dragon, etc., etc. So you have more limitations because some people say, well, video games it's freedom, and in terms of creating, writing is more freedom because the only limit is your imagination. Well, your lifespan. You know, if you have time to write that, but that's the only limit. But in video games, you're working with a team up with limited resources. Well, there are some super genius guys that do all this video game stuff by themselves, but usually you're working with other people because to make a video game you need a lot of skills. You need programming, you need art, you need music, lots of things. So that also it's a change because you need to be part of the team. You need to help them. You don't need to, hey, this is my story, it has to be that way. No, you have to make something that helps the game and resonates with everything. I think that the perfect game is not the most expensive one or the most flashy or whatever. Is the one that is coherent in all their parts. It can be a small game, but if the story, the mechanics, the art, everything goes in the same direction, the experience is perfect. Well, not perfect. There is no perfect game, but as closer as it can be. The video games, what they have is that the player is unpredictable because you put a system in front of them, so they have limits of what they can do. But within your system, they're going to do things that you couldn't imagine. That's what is called emergent gameplay, even emergent narrative, with which is when the stories are drawn for the mechanics, but nobody planned it. So you need to have you need to think about what is going to do what the player is going to do. If you're integrating the interactivity, it's not like a movie. You see the movie or you read the book, and of course you can do a linear narrative inside a game. But even with a linear narrative, you know that the gameplay is also there. So sometimes they aren't even aligned. Maybe a player can say the character of the player can say I'm a pacifist, and then the player is shooting everything. So you need to try to put those things in order too. And another thing is that if you want to give narrative freedom in terms of changing the history, changing the story of the game, uh, from the actions of the player, you have to plan ahead a lot, and sometimes it's super expensive. So usually it's complex. Of course, there are clever ways to do it. Sometimes the end is the same, but the trip, the travel, the journey is different, and sometimes you can adequate the tone or the storytelling to each player. So each player is at least putting it their own personality into the narrative, although it ends in the same way or two endings or whatever. So the most difficult thing is the human factor. Probably nowadays the best narrative branching story because as the story is telling by another human being can improvise, can adapt on the run, and once again, it's drawn from their imagination. So it doesn't have the limits from a video game. It's super interesting. From the master perspective, the game director, or the players, because it's a way to be inside the world without any limits. And if you have a good master, a good storyteller, it's amazing. And I don't know, it's something like theater, but it's not theater, and it has something in common with a video game, but it's not video gaming. Super cool. I have also played um I don't know the term in English, like live role playing, when you're not in a you dress like a knight or whatever, and and that's amazing too. Yeah, of course, then you have the limits of the physical space, but you're interacting with a lot of real people pretending to be a character, and that's amazing. We say in Spain a lot of times that there's no real industry, in the sense that if you don't have a work or you get fired or something like that, there's not a fast rotation at first. It has improved a lot in latest years. In fact, in Spain, there's the so-called golden era of the Spanish video games, with it was the 80s, before the 16 bits, in which we have a lots of games, some of them really revolutionary from the time. I think the most famous is La Abadía del Crimen, the crime abbey, which is based on the name of the rose, and it was like an open world in a monastery, which you had, like in the book, you need to solve a murder, and for the time it was super revolutionary, and I think that the game code wrote wrote it itself, even to solve memory problems, something like that. The guys were genius, the guys who did it. But right now we are having like a second golden age or something like that, thanks to technologies like Unity and Unreal. Now making video games is cheaper. You can do it at home. It's not easier, but at least it's possible. Before that, we have like a couple of big Spanish studios, but right now we are doing a lot of video games here. Some of these are particularly famous, like I don't know, Greece, Blasphemous, Narita Boy this year. Well, the latest Metroid was done here in Madrid. So yeah, it's growing, but I think we have a long way to walk still. I think it's probably Heat Signature, which is it's a little difficult to describe, but it's a roguelike, a space roguelike. You go in your little ship and you board other ships, and then you have to capture them. And the super cool thing about that game are the systems. For example, you can teleport yourself, and you can also throw things for the window, so you can throw yourself by a window, then teleport you and change your position with another enemy, so the enemy goes into space. Or you can slow time, and then when they shoot you, they shoot their part. It's difficult. If you see in action, if you play, you understand it. But in fact, when I start playing, I didn't understand. But when there's a time that your brain clicks, and suddenly you're doing amazing things. It's something like Matrix in space, you know. And really cool, and how the story is told, because it's really a simple story, but all the missions are related to characters, and every character has like a personal mission, like save your brother or steal this for something. And if you get captured, sometimes you can rescue that character. A new character is generated, like I need to rescue my stupid brother who was kidnapped by this corporation, and it was your fault. And another interesting thing is that it also takes characters from your friends on Steam, so you're rescuing your friends' characters, and that create. They're not complex narratives, but they're personal to you and your friends, and they have a lot of impact. So that mix of cool mechanics and little narrative, but really personal, I think that make it an incredible game. This kind of personalization things, there are little touches. That's a thing that movies can't do, or books can't do, and sometimes it's just, I don't know, deciding which color you're going to go, or the name of a character, and that those little touches have an emotional impact that sometimes some video games don't even think about it, but when you get a video game that does it right, the experience is much better. I think it has a lot of potential, not only personalizing, but usually games is like, okay, you have this level, you have this music, you have this level, you have this music, but there are lots of things that can be done with music, and I think that's a part of video games that is on. Well, there have so little things that have been done and has a lot of potential. Some games do this thing about playing some instruments and making some transitions, but much more could be done. We did an experiment with a children game about figure skating, in which we compose. Well, you need a proper musician and composer to do that, because you can do the logic, but music has its own logic. And this system we made takes seconds of music, and it composes in the run. And for this gameplay is really important, because well, figure skatings, they do their thing with the music, but in a video game is the other way around, because you don't know what the player is going to do. As I said, the player is you can't control it. So what we do is, depending on the actions, the music goes one way or another. Of course, composing every theme for that game was a nightmare for the musician, because it was like 300 pieces per song. So it was super difficult for him, but he did super good job, and the results, you can people who doesn't know that, they don't realize that the game is being composed on the run, and the music is different for every player, so that's a plus too. I would really like to get to this point, but you need a proper game to do that, in which people is talking about the story, and making theories, and and connecting with the characters. Say, okay, I don't. what do you think is going to happen? That kind of thing. Because in video games you can tell a story and then hide lots of things. You can use environmental in storytelling. You could, well, like Dark Souls, they put descriptions on the items, and that creates story. That kind of thing I really like people invested in your world and trying to understand them to create, even to create new material of that. I would really like that. But of course, you need the proper video game with that world. So I hope to make it one day. I'm not 100% sure because I write really varied themes. But it's true that I got drawn to science fiction, fantasy, and terror, horror. I really like those themes, and it's not almost 90% or 95% of what I write is in those genres. And I usually go a lot into comedy. Sometimes I'm writing a story and I can't avoid it. I start making jokes and do ridiculous things. And so I really like to write comedy. Not always, of course, in terror is more difficult, but you can do it. That kind of pathos in the middle of the loft. It's hard, but you can do it too. And in terms of humanity and thematics, a lot of depends on what is happening in my life. So sometimes I'm interested about that kind of thing, or I've been exposed to some things. So I'm not really sure. Although there are sometimes that I have characters that do really stupid things, but I think that I do it unconsciously because that's superhuman. You know, we have this idea of people that are stupid or clever or wise or silly, but the truth is that we all have those moments, you know. And I think it's really interesting, and it happens in life. You have this guy you think that is super intelligent, and he is, and suddenly he does the most stupid thing in his life. And well, it's real life, so it's realistic. So I think those moments have a lot of potential, but I don't do it consciously. But sometimes happen. Sometimes you don't even go for realism. And I think that's cool. I think nowadays realism it's really valued. People look for that, and I think, and you can see in the TV shows there are more flawed protagonists than ever. And I think that's a thing that you can, a way that you can connect. But sometimes it's good to have also some perfect protagonist. Although you can revert everything in the end, just revealing one detail. Like, because sometimes the flow is the motivation. Like, you are super good, but you are doing, I don't know, for the money. Could be super simple, but maybe because you are super afraid and people think that you are brave and you live scared because you need to be an example. There's always like a little detail that you can use. The funny thing is that that was going to be a mobile game for one player, but at first it didn't work, and I wasn't even working there. So when I got it, we had this idea to do a cooperative game for two players because we have a character in each side of the screen, and repurpose it for consoles and PC. So I started studying a little because I haven't done a cooperative game ever, but I had played a lot with my wife. So I had hours of experience of a players, which it was super good because before going to live with my wife, I didn't have a lot of experience. Most of my multiplayer games were online, but we were looking for this experience when you are together. You can play online, but I think for this game, the best experience is to have to be in the room, in the same room, the same coach. So there are a lot of, I think there are not super good cooperative games that you have a great mechanic, which is good, and you put one player and other player, and that's it. But it's really similar to have an AI working with you. So what I think is the key is communication. So you need to bring part of the game outside of the screen. You need to force the players to talk together or and even gel together, because I suppose you can do with turns and more relaxed like I said, environment, and you can go to that. But the fun part of the fun relies on having the stress of of having to solve the levels. In our case, there are enemies spawning continually, so you need to reach the objectives. And in the middle of the case of the screen, you need to do things together with the other player. In our case, one of the most important mechanics is to cast a spell that changes the enemies, the color of the enemy. So you need to pick up 4 color essence, and you need to talk with your partner, because you could go for red or green or half red, half green, something like that. So first, your objective, you need to agree with your partner. Usually in a video game, you know what is your objective. We give a little freedom in each level, so it's not super clear. You can go first to one thing or whatever. So you need to talk, and then to cast the spell, they need to press the button at the same time. So they need to do it, and they need to do it at the best time. Sometimes it's better to do it fast. Sometimes it's better to do it to wait until the screen is full. It really depends. I try to create a system that could give a lot of variety, objectives, and situations in which the players needs to talk or yell. Because when you see it with 2 players playing, the experience is super good, because they're yelling at each other, and they're laughing, and when you're doing that, the experience it's elevated, because you are having physical reactions that usually when you're playing, it's just your mind. So of course you can get a little emotional, but you are with the other guy, and that's like feedback, emotional feedback between the 2 players. And another thing that I realized is that losing in single player usually is frustrating, but not in multiplayer. It's like funny, not funny, like they're laugh. Hey, it was your fault. Yeah, sorry. Okay, let's try again. And that's the thing that I wanted to do in the game, and the thing that I saw studying other cooperative games. And I think that's the secret, that for that particular genre, take part of the gameplay outside of the game. What I think it's really interesting is how indie games are approaching narrative, because I think most of the not everything, but most of the innovations are coming from them, because they need to put new things or uh, new experience in the table, because they don't have millions of money to make super high fidelity graphics, or to pay a super campaign. But they need to keep it cheap too. It is what we talked about earlier. They can't do a super branching game that they have to develop tens of versions of itself. So there are a lot of little tricks they do to improve the narrative experience. Like for example, tying mechanics to the story. A lot of one common practice in video games is like, okay, you can choose, and sometimes you make a decision. But what I'm seeing in a lot of video games is that your actions makes the decision, which is also really realistic, because in our lives, most of our decisions, they're not a binary decision proposed by one person or whatever. You're taking decisions all the time, and that affects you. If you're condensing that experience, I don't know, in 5 hours, of course, a lot of decisions you take in half an hour are going to have an impact. And that kind of organic systems create another kind of narrative, and the player is immersed in that, but sometimes even don't realize about it. I think one game that do it perfectly, and that's why it had so success, was Undertale. But you have a combat system in which you can kill your enemies or spare them, and that have lots of narrative implications. And the game is constantly playing with you, and also remembers things that you did that you thought there wasn't important. Because one of the things that the game does is playing with your preconception of what a video game is. Because we as players, there are things that we get for granted. and the game puts them upside down, and the characters within the game react to those little things. I don't want to be specific because I think it's better to play that game without knowing anything. I hope that big companies are taking notes too, because I always say that it's a little sad that there are lots of narrative things or even mechanic things that AAA games could do because of the money, because they could invest a lot of narrative and storytelling, but they usually invest on graphics and marketing. So I think there's a lost opportunity there, but it depends on the market. If people, and what I mean people is million of players start asking for that, there will be a shift, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Although I'm seeing different structures or structures more common on indie games now in AAA games. I don't know if they're taking notes like Returnal, which is a roguelike basically, or Deathloop, which I think it was released last month, and they use a little time loop mechanic when you go back and you start understanding the world by repeating the same day, that kind of thing. I think there are lots of super cool ideas and concepts that could be applied for more expensive games, so they could explore a bit more. But in the meantime, I think the indie games are doing super good.